The Storm by Midnight Malmar. She inserted her key in the lock and turned the knob. The March wind snatched the door out of her hand and slammed it against the wall. It took strength to close it again against the wind, and as soon as she closed it, the rain came in pounding downpour, beating noisily against the windows as if trying to follow her in. She could not hear the taxi as it started up and went back down the road. She breathed a sigh of thankfulness at being home again and in time. In rain like this, the crossroads always were flooded. Half an hour later, her cab could not have got through the rising water, and there was no alternative route. There was no light anywhere in the house. Ben was not home then. As she turned on the lamp by the sofa, she had a sense of anticlimax. All the way home, she had been visiting her sister for a month. She pictured herself returning to a lighted house, to Ben, who would be sitting by the fire with his paper. She had taken delight in picturing his happy surprise at seeing her, home a week earlier than he had expected her. She had known just how his round face would light up, how his eyes would twinkle behind his glasses, how he would catch her by the shoulders and kiss her resoundingly on both cheeks. Then she would make her coffee and find a piece of cake, and they would sit together by the fire and talk. But Ben wasn't here. She looked at the clock on the mantel and saw it was nearly 10. Perhaps he had not planned to come home tonight. As he was not expecting her, even before she had left, he frequently was in the city all night because business kept him too late to catch the last train. If he did not come soon, he would not be able to make it at all. She did not like the thought. The storm was growing worse. She could hear the wild lash of the trees, the whistle of the wind around the corners of the little house. For the first time, she regretted this move to the far suburbs. There had been neighbors at first, a quarter-mile down the road, but they moved away several months ago, and now their house stood empty. She had thought nothing of lonesomeness. It was perfect here for two. She had taken such pleasure in fixing up her house, her very own house, and caring for it, that she had not missed the company other than Ben. But now, alone and with the storm trying to batter its way in, she found it frightening to be so far away from other people. There was no one this side of the crossroads. The road that had passed the house wandered past farmland into the nothingness in the thick woods a mile further on. She began to walk through the house, turning on lights as she went. Ben had left it in fairly good order. There was very little trace of an untidy masculine presence, but then he was a tidy man. She began to realize that the house was cold. Of course, Ben would have lowered the thermostat. He was very careful about things like that. He would not tolerate waste. No wonder it was cold. The thermostat was set at 58. She pushed the little needle up to 70, and the motor in the cellar started so suddenly and noisily that it frightened her for a moment. She went into the kitchen and made some coffee. While she waited for it to drip, she began to prowl around the lower floor. She was curiously restless and could not relax. Yet, it was good to be back again among her own things in her own home. She studied the living room with fresh eyes. Yes, it was a pleasant room, even though it was small. But her plants, set so bravely along the windowsill, had died. Ben had forgotten to water them. She returned to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee, wishing that Ben would come home to share it with her. She carried her cup into the living room and set it on the small round table beside Ben's special big chair. The furnace was still mumbling busily, sending up heat, but she was colder than ever. She shivered and got an old jacket of Ben's from the closet and wrapped it around her before she sat down. The wind hammered at the door and the windows, and the air was full of the sound of water racing in the gutters, pouring from the leaders, thudding on the roof. Listening, she wished for Ben almost feverishly. She never had felt so alone, and he was such a comfort. He had been so good about her going for this long visit to see her ill sister. He had seen to everything and had put her on the train with her arms loaded with books and candy and fruit. She knew those farewell gifts had meant a lot to him. He didn't spend money easily. He was a good husband, although he was 10 years older than she and a little set in his ways, a little, perhaps, moody. He had given her what she thought she wanted, security and a home of her own. She wished he would come. The wind shook the house, and a branch crashed on the roof. A movement at the window caught her eye. She froze there, not breathing. The glimmer of white at the window, behind the blur of rain, had been, she was sure of it, a human face. There had been eyes. She was certain there had been eyes staring in at her. She was rigid for a long time, never taking her eyes from the window, but nothing moved there now except the water on the window pane. Behind it, there was blackness, and that was all. The only sounds were the thrashing of the trees, the roar of water, and the ominous howl of the wind. She began to breathe again and found courage to turn out the light and go to the window. She must have imagined those staring eyes. Nobody could be out on a night like this. Nobody. Yet she found herself terribly shaken. If only Ben would come home. If only she were not so alone. She shivered and pulled Ben's coat tighter around her and told herself she was becoming a fool. Nevertheless, she found the aloneness intolerable. Her ears strained to hear prowling footsteps outside the window. She became convinced that she did not hear them, slow and heavy. Perhaps Ben could be reached at the hotel where he sometimes stayed. She no longer cared whether her homecoming was a surprise to him. She wanted to hear his voice. She went to the telephone and lifted the receiver. The line was quite dead. The wires were down, of course. She fought panic. The face at the window had been an illusion, a trick of the light reflected on the pane, and the sound of footsteps was an illusion too. Actual ones would be inaudible in the noise made by the windstorm. Nobody would be out tonight. Nothing threatened her really. The storm was held at bay beyond these walls, and in the morning the sun would shine again. The thing to do was to make herself as comfortable as possible and settle down with a book. There was no use going to bed. She couldn't possibly sleep. She would only lie there, wide awake, and think of that face at the window, hear the footsteps. She would get some wood for a fire in the fireplace. She hesitated at the top of the cellar stairs. The light, as she switched it on, seemed insufficient. Wind was chilling her ankles, and the floor was wet with rain. The cellar door at the bottom of the stairs, the door that led to outside, was standing open. The open door increased her panic. It took her a long minute to nerve herself to go down these steps and reach out into the darkness for the doorknob. In just that instant she was soaked, but her darting eyes could find nothing outdoors but the black, wavering shapes of the maples at the side of the house. The wind helped her and slammed the door resoundingly. She jammed the bolt home with all her strength and then tested it to make sure it would hold. She almost sobbed with the relief of knowing it to be firm against any intruder. She stood with her wet clothes clinging to her while the thought came that turned her bones to water. Suppose the face at the window had been real after all. Suppose its owner had found shelter, and the only shelter to be had within a quarter mile. This cellar. She almost flew up the stairs again, but then she took herself firmly in hand. She must not let herself go. She had only to get an armful of wood. Then she could have a fire. She could have the light and warmth and comfort. She would forget those terrors. The cellar smelled of dust and old moisture. The beams were fuzzed with cobwebs. There was only one light, a dim one in the corner. The wood pile was in the far corner away from the light. She stood and peered around. Nobody could hide here. The cellar was too open. Nothing was down here with her now but the snarl of the storm. She almost ran to the woodpile. Then something made her pause and turn before she bent to gather the logs. What was it? Not a noise. Something she had seen as she hurried across that dusty floor. Something odd. She searched with her eyes. It was a spark of light that she had seen, where no spark should be. An inexplicable dread clutched at her heart. Her eyes widened. Her old trunk that stood against the wall was open just a crack. From the crack came this tiny pinpoint of reflected light. She went toward it like a woman hypnotized. There was no reason for her to feel smothered in terror, yet she was sure she had not only closed, but clamped the lid on that trunk. Now the lid was raised perhaps an inch, and the twinkle of light was still there. She threw back the lid. For a long moment, she stood looking down into the trunk, while each detail of its contents imprinted itself on her brain like an image on a film. Each tiny detail was indelibly clear and never to be forgotten. She could not have stirred a muscle in that moment. Horror surrounded her like a black, heavy cloak, stopping her breath, freezing her limbs. She slammed down the lid and ran up the stairs like a mad thing. She was breathing again in deep, sobbing breaths that tore at her lungs. She shut the door at the top of the stairs with a crash that shook the house. Then she turned the key. Gasping, she clutched one of the sturdy maple chairs by the kitchen table and wedged it under the knob with the hand she could barely control. The wind shook the house in its teeth like a dog shakes a rat. Her first impulse was to get out of the house. But in the time it took to get to the front door, she remembered the face at the window. Perhaps she had not imagined it. Perhaps it was the face of a murderer waiting for her out there in the storm, ready to spring on her out of the dark. She fell into the big chair, her huddled body shaken by great tremors. She could not stay here, not with that thing in her trunk, yet she dared not leave. Her whole being cried out for Ben. He would know what to do. She closed her eyes, opened them again, rubbed them hard. The picture was still burned into her brain. Her old trunk had held the curled-up body of a woman. She had not seen the face. The head had been tucked down, and a shower of fair hair had fallen over it. The woman had worn a red dress. One hand had rested near the edge of the trunk, and on its third finger there had been a man's ring, with a raised figure of a wild lion with a small diamond between its paws. It had been the diamond that caught the light. She never would be able to forget it. Never forget how the woman looked. Shudders continued to shake her. She bit her tongue and pressed her hand against her jaw to stop the chattering of her teeth. The salty taste of blood in her mouth steadied her. She tried to force herself to be rational, to plan, yet all the time the knowledge that she was imprisoned with the body of a murdered woman kept beating at her nerves. She drew the coat closer around her. Slowly, she realized that there would be consequences. There would be policemen. At first, the thought of policemen was a comforting one. Big, brawny men in blue who would take the thing out of her cellar, take it away so she'd never need think of it again. Then she realized it was her cellar, hers and Ben's, and the policemen are suspicious and prying. Would they think she killed the woman? How could they be made to believe she never had seen her before? Or would they think Ben had done it? Would they take Ben's absences on business, and her own visit to her sister, about which Ben was so helpful, and build a story of a double life? Would they insist that the woman had been discarded mistress, who had hounded him with letters until, out of desperation, he had killed her? That was a ridiculous theory, really, but the police might do that. They might. Now, a sudden new panic invaded her. The dead woman must be taken out of the cellar, must be hidden. The police must never connect her with this house. Yet, the dead woman was bigger than she herself was. She could never move her. Her craving for Ben became a frantic need. If only he would come home. Come home and take that body away, hide it somewhere so the police could not connect it with this house. He was strong enough to do it. Even with the strength to move the body by herself, she would not dare do it, because there was no prowler, real or imaginary, outside the house. Perhaps the cellar door had not been opened by chance, or perhaps it had been, and the murderer, seeing it so welcoming, had seized the opportunity to plant the evidence of his crime here. The voice of the storm drowned out all other sounds, yet she was sure that she heard footsteps going round and round the house, that eyes spied upon her. She pulled the shades down over the shiny black windows. It helped a little to make her feel more secure, more sheltered, but only a very little. Nothing could comfort her now but Ben's plump shoulder on his arm around her and his neat, capable mind planning to remove the dead woman from this house. She went back to the chair and curled up in it. She prayed mutely for Ben and for the daylight. The clock said 12:30. She huddled there, not moving, not thinking, not even afraid, only numb for another hour. Then the storm stopped for a moment, and in the silence she heard footsteps on the walk. Actual footsteps, firm and quick and loud. A key turned in the lock. The door opened and Ben came in. He was dripping, dirty, and exhausted, but it was Ben. When she was sure of it, she flung herself on him, babbling incoherently of what she had found. He kissed her lightly on the cheek and took her arms down from around his neck. "My dear, you'll get soaked. I'm drenched." He removed his glasses and handed them to her. She began to dry them for him. His eyes squinted at the light. "I had to walk in from the crossroads. What a night!" He began to strip off his coat and shoes. "You'll never know what a difference it made finding the place lighted. Lord, it's good to be home." She tried again to tell him of the past hours, but again he cut her short. "Now wait a minute, my dear. I can see you're bothered about something. Just wait until I get into some dry things. Then I'll come down and we'll straighten it out. Suppose you rustle up some coffee and toast." He did look tired, she thought with concern. Now that he was back, she could wait. The past hours were a nightmare, horrifying and unreal. With Ben here, so solid and commonplace and cheerful, she began to wonder if the hours were a nightmare. She even began to doubt the reality of the woman in the trunk, although she could see her as vividly as ever. Perhaps only the storm was real. She went to the kitchen and began to make fresh coffee. The chair, still wedged against the kitchen door, was a reminder of her terror. Now that Ben was home, it seemed silly, and she put it back in its place by the table. He came down very soon, before the coffee was ready. How good it was to see him in that old gray bathrobe of his hands thrust into its pockets. She was almost embarrassed when she told him of the face at the window, the open door, and finally of the body in the trunk. "You poor child, the storm scared you to death. It's given you the terrors." He smiled dubiously. "Yes, I'm almost beginning to think so. Now that you're back, it seems so safe. But will you look in the trunk, Ben? I've got to know. I can see her so plainly. How could I imagine a thing like that?" He said indulgently, "Of course, I'll look. If it will make you feel better, I'll do it now. Then I can have my coffee in peace." He went to the cellar door and opened it and snapped on the light. Her heart began to pound once more. The cellar door opened. The body, the police, the suspicions that would cluster about her and Ben, the need to hide this evidence of somebody's crime. She could not have imagined it. It was incredible that she could have believed for a minute that her mind had played such tricks on her. In another moment, Ben would know it too. She heard the thud as he threw back the lid of the trunk. She clutched at the back of the chair, waiting for his voice. It came in an instant. She could not believe it. It was as cheerful and reassuring as before. He said, "There's nothing here but a couple of bundles. Come take a look." Her knees were weak as she bent down the stairs, down into the cellar again. It was still musty and damp and draped with cobwebs. The light was still dim. It was just as she remembered it, except that now the wind was whistling through a broken window, and rain was splattered in on the bits of shattered glass on the floor. Ben was standing by the open trunk waiting for her. "See," he said, "there's nothing. Just some old clothes of yours, I guess." She went to stand beside him. Was she losing her mind? Would she now see that the crushed figure in there, see the red dress and the smooth shining knees, when Ben could not, and the ring with the diamond between the lion's paws? Her eyes looked almost reluctantly into the trunk. "It's empty!" There were the neat newspaper wrapped packages she had put away so carefully, just as she had left them deep in the bottom of the trunk, and nothing else. She must have imagined the body. She was light with the relief of knowledge brought her, and yet confused and frightened too. How could her mind play such tricks on her? Dreamed it all. I must have, she admitted. Yet it was so horribly clear, and I wasn't asleep. Her voice broke. I thought, oh, Ben, I thought. What did you think, my dear? His voice was odd. Not like Ben's at all. It had a cold, cunning edge to it. He stood looking down at her with an immobility that chilled her more than the cold wind that swept in through the broken window. She tried to read his face, but the light from the little bulb was too weak. It left his features shadowed in broad, dark planes that made him look like a stranger and somehow sinister. She said, I, and faltered. He still did not move, but his voice hardened. What was it you thought? She backed away from him. He moved then. It was only to take his hands from his pockets, to stretch his arms towards her, but she stood for an instant staring at something that caught her eye. She was never to know whether his arms had been outstretched to take her in embrace or to clutch at her white neck, for she had turned and ran, stumbling up the stairs in a mad panic of escape. He had shouted, Janet, Janet! His steps were heavy behind her. He tripped on the bottom step and fell on one knee and cursed. Terror lent her strength and speed. She could not be mistaken. Although she had only seen it once, she knew that on the little finger of his left hand there had been the unmistakable ring the dead woman had worn. The blessed wind snatched the front door from her and flung it wide, and she was out in the safe, dark shelter of the storm.